Shalom and welcome back to Israel with Aline. These waters, which at first may seem so simple, are actually very important biblically speaking, because these waters are part of the waters that supply Solomon's gigantic pools. And today we're going to explore this incredible place together, as well as the new archaeological discoveries. And to join us on this journey, we have a very special guest. So everyone say shalom.
Shalom, Aline. Shalom to all of you at home, once again, to talk about news from antiquity.
So everyone, it's a pleasure to have the archaeologist Rodrigo Silva here with us. So if you're ready, let's get started. Look at this incredible giant pool, but it's just one of three pools, and this is the smallest of the three. So imagine the others, which we will also see more of today. We're also going to see the others, but just imagine that this is just a small sample of Solomon's colossal pool system.
And, by the way, not only that, this is the smallest of the three, and there's a fourth one that's not here. We won't show it in today's program. That one alone is almost the size of the three you'll see today. So, really, the engineering of the past is something that leaves you in awe.
Exactly. Sometimes we think that people in the past were simpler. They didn't have our technology. No, they didn't have our technology, but they had an extremely advanced technology, just different from ours. So here we have the pool. The question I want you to answer for everyone is whether this pool really belonged to Solomon.
Well, good question. We were doing all this work to show you how archaeologists identify places from the past. There are several clues. The map. If I know that city A is here, and I have an ancient account that a certain number of kilometers from there was city B. Well, from the map, you can get an idea, because we don't find a sign saying, "Welcome to Bethlehem, come again." For ancient times, we have to deduce that this was Bethlehem. So you look at the distance from Jerusalem, and so on. I also talked to you about the Arab tradition and the Byzantine Christian tradition. It is important because I'm talking about people who passed through here centuries ago and gave names to the places. And they were much closer to the biblical source, to the historical source, than we are. And in the case of Solomon, they make a whole correlation based on some details. First, there is a tradition. It cannot be archaeologically confirmed that this was the place because it had a water spring. In ancient times, Solomon used to come here to get inspired in order to write his poems, his love letters. For example, in the book of Song of Songs, chapter 7, verse 4, Solomon says, "Your eyes are like the pools of Heshbon by the gate of Bath Rabbim." Well, this is not Heshbon. And where Heshbon was, I don't know. By the way, a very quick side note. You know that Heshbon, the biblical Heshbon, is a frustration I have in my archaeological life. Because I worked excavating there in Jordan at an archaeological site called Tel Rishbon, or Tel Rishban. And why this name Rishban? Because we thought that was the city of Heshbon mentioned in the Bible. But as you keep excavating, there's a level, and if you don't find anything below here, you don't have anything contemporary. So, the city we were excavating wasn't Heshbon, even though it still has the wrong name to this day. We have another hypothesis about where the city of Heshbon might be, but I only mentioned this because of the passage in Song of Songs, chapter 7, verse 4. Here, Solomon talks about the pools of Heshbon, and there were pools that supplied the cities at that time, and he makes a comparison of love. When you go, still in Solomon's writings, in Ecclesiastes, chapter 2, verse 6, he says, "I made myself pools of water, reservoirs of water, to water the grove in which the trees flourished." By the way, here's an interesting fact, right, Aline? We're actually doing this program right now during the New Year of the Trees, which is a very interesting year here in the Holy Land. Back to what I was saying, Solomon said he built water reservoirs. But the text in Ecclesiastes doesn't say where these reservoirs were. Archaeologically speaking, we still don't have any evidence of a reservoir, of a water storage system built by Solomon. There are signs of something possibly from Rehoboam's time, but it is more certain during Hezekiah's era and later. But the tradition remained, and from then on, people started to think it was from here that Solomon wrote some of his passages. Maybe David also wrote some of his psalms here. But we also have to set some limits to this tradition, because in Jerusalem, you can even give us this example. There are the stables of Solomon. In the temple, there's a place in the old city of Jerusalem that's called the stables of Solomon, but it has nothing to do with Solomon. Talk a little about that.
So Solomon's stables really were stables, but they are not from Solomon's time. What happened is that the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is located on the Temple Mount, was turned into a church by the Templars during the time of the Crusades. And when the Templars take over the Al-Aqsa Mosque, they believe that the Temple of Solomon was located there. So they start calling that place the Temple of Solomon. And the stables next to it, they say, so if the temple was here, these are Solomon's stables. They use them as stables, but in reality, they are not. We know that the location of the temple is not where the Al-Aqsa Mosque is, but rather where the Dome of the Rock is. I mean, just a few dozen meters to the side, not very far, but for archaeologists, it makes all the difference in the world.
I'm referring to the 12th century, which is far removed from biblical times. Not every tradition is something we simply accept. So, some names that are given are somewhat artificial, others might be a clue.
So the work of archaeologists is to prove what is found, but also when it's wrong to say, look, that's not it. Another example is the famous Tower of David. People come to Jerusalem, take pictures, go visit the Tower of David, but the Tower of David is not a tower, and it's not David's. Guys, I'm sorry to spoil sometimes some people's dreams, but the Tower of David is actually the minaret of a mosque built during the time of the Ottoman Empire. So it's the Ottoman minaret, not the Tower of David. And the minaret is built on top of the remains, actually of an older tower, but this older tower belonged to Herod, who lived 2,000 years ago, not David, 3,000 years ago. So archaeology can be based on many things like clues. So we use names, for example, Baitin. When it was excavated next to Baitin, they found biblical Bethel. So we can use names as clues, traditions as clues. But we also need the integrity when we excavate to say, okay, this was the tradition, and was the tradition proven or not? And there are many things that, yes, have been proven. I mean, there are places where we can say without any doubt, these were the temple stairs. This here is Capernaum. There are so many places where we can say without any doubt it was here. And there are places like where we are, that this pool is from the biblical period, however.
It's not from Solomon. You can see. So, we're talking about cross-references that we use. And then comes another question. We take the references, the parts, the old cartography, testimonies from pilgrims who passed through here 2,000 years ago, and the biblical reference itself. But then we have to see what's underneath and also analyze something called architectural style. I'm married to Laura, who has a degree in architecture, though she isn't practicing as an architect now. And I talk a lot about architecture with her, and Laura, when she goes to this building here, says, this is Niemeyer. When she says it's a building by Oscar Niemeyer, it's because of the shape of the building, because of the design. In the interior of Minas Gerais, you notice the colonial houses are from the colonial Brazil period. Exactly. Even someone who isn't an expert in architecture can clearly notice the difference between a house from Ouro Preto, the style of a house from Ouro Preto, and a house from Brasilia, and also the style of a city in the countryside of Bahia compared to a city in the countryside of Rio Grande do Sul. So you notice the style, both of the era, chronology, colonial Brazil, Oscar Niemeyer, as well as regionalisms, construction from Bahia, construction from Rio Grande do Sul, and we do that in archaeology. Then, when we analyze all these pools, these reservoirs that we see here, we realize that the construction style is not from Solomon's time. It's from the time of another king, much less glorious in terms of morals and character. In fact, a wicked king, also mentioned in the Bible, just like Solomon, who claimed many titles for himself, but deep down was worth nothing. I'm talking about Herod the Great, the same Herod who, right here in Bethlehem, ordered the killing of the little children. At the time of Jesus' birth, when the wise men came from the east, this Herod, although he was notorious and of questionable character, was an excellent administrator as a politician, and he liked to do lavish things, grandiose works. And he, then, is the one responsible for the construction of this complex here, except for one part, which was discovered just now, last year, and we will talk about it later. But what we have here is Herod's construction. It may be that in 2, 3, or 4 years from now, archaeologists will find evidence that below here there is a construction older than Herod. It might be. I'm not saying it is, but it's possible. So, what should I do? That's another challenge in archaeology. Should I destroy one antiquity to see what's below? I can't do that. And then it might happen that a laborer or a pipeline that the city is going to install here ends up digging for a modern reason and finds an ancient construction. Anyway, Herod did a brilliant job. Look, folks, even today, with all the technology, even São Paulo needs water reservoir storage. And back then, they already had this idea. So, it's a collection of 3 pools, 3 huge ones, which are in turn supplied by another larger pool. And they come from reservoirs far from Jerusalem that supplied the city of Jerusalem. And this one here is the smallest of them.
So I think we can maybe put a map here on the screen. And we can see a complex of several springs that gather water through aqueducts into pools, and the water is taken from one pool to another. And this was really the main reservoir. These 3 pools were the last big reservoir before reaching Jerusalem. And it really makes perfect sense that it belonged to King Herod the Great, because King Herod, first of all, was the greatest builder in the history of Israel.
Despite being, as a person,
there are no words to describe his cruelty. Both the massacres he committed in Bethlehem and how he killed his own children. He killed the
wife he loved.
The wife he loved, Mariamne. I mean, looking at him as a person, he was really terrible. However, he was the greatest builder of this region. He built Masada, he built the palaces of Jericho, he built the tomb of the patriarchs, and he also built this water system. And he expanded the temple of Jerusalem, and when he expanded the temple, that increased even more the number of pilgrims to Jerusalem. Does that mean Jerusalem needed more water? So it's like building a new neighborhood. It's not enough to just pave the streets. You also need to provide electricity, water, you need to build schools, you need to build bus stops. So when you're going to build a residential building, you need to create an entire infrastructure around it. And that's exactly what happened. When he builds the temple in Jerusalem, he needs to add infrastructure for the pilgrims. And part of that infrastructure is exactly these reservoirs. And now we do know that they are not from Solomon's time. At least we don't have proof of that yet, but they were definitely already here in Jesus' time.
Exactly. So we're talking about a pool that's at least 2,100 years old, because it's from the 1st century before Christ, built by Herod to supply the city. Obviously, it was surrounded by soldiers here, and it was supplied in 2 ways: by springs, which are farther from here, and also by rainwater. So, they made use of rainwater and springs, they stored it. And this water had to last the whole year for the sanctuary services. Let's see the others.
Come on, everyone, it's really impressive. Let's go.
Behind me are 400 truckloads of Temple Mount soil that were illegally dumped in 1999 like trash. But 2 archaeologists refused to let it disappear. They rescued the soil and created the Temple Mount Sifting Project. Today, over 500,000 artifacts have been recovered. Pottery from Solomon's temple, coins from Jesus' time, pieces of history that were meant to be lost forever. Now you can be part of this rescue mission, get authentic Temple Mount soil delivered to your door, and help keep biblical archaeology alive. Scan the QR code or use the link below.
We can see here right next to us another one of the pools, and look at the size of this pool. And I also like this one more than the other because it's better preserved. Here we can also see a good part of the original construction, the Herodian construction. The pool exists, there's even water inside, but it's no longer used as a water source to supply the city around here. What we see, and we even saw some people around here, are people who come here to fish because it ended up working like a reservoir. So there are fish here, and people come to fish.
Have picnics?
Have picnics. Families come around here, and there are also people who go swimming here even though it's not allowed. And in fact, we have records of cases of people who drowned here in this place. Because even though it might not seem like it at first glance, this pool is really, really deep. So it really is a risk, and unfortunately this has already happened here a few times.
In fact, even though they're no longer used today, it's important to mention that even during the Ottoman period, these pools were still in use. Because although its entire foundation is Herodian, part of the lining is from the Turkish Ottoman period. I'm talking about the 16th century up to the beginning of the 20th century. So even though right now the city no longer uses this as a water supply, if I'm talking about Herod, in the 1st century before Christ, up to the Ottoman period, I'm talking about at least 1600, 1700, 1900 years, when these reservoirs were still used to supply at least the city of Bethlehem and some nearby towns. And today, people no longer need this water supply. Unfortunately, for a very, very long time, these 3 pools, we showed 2, the first, the second, there's still a 3rd one. Down there, they were left very neglected. There's still a lot of dirt here, but some work has been done. The tourism department is still working to try to revitalize this place, build a restaurant, attract tourists here. There's still work to do, but it's much better than before. There are some photos taken in the 1930s where some of these pools were filled with dirt. So work was done to excavate, to clean all of this, and it's fascinating to see how history brings together the past and the present. Now, there was a discovery recently, last year, related to this complex, which brought another chapter to our understanding of this.
Exactly, because we know that when Herod built these pools, he built this complex. There was an aqueduct that started here and went directly to the temple in Jerusalem, but now a new aqueduct has been discovered that also started here and went to Jerusalem, but to what is called the Upper City, which was the neighborhood of the richest and most important houses where the priests lived. So a second aqueduct was built, starting here and going to Jerusalem, but this aqueduct is from after Herod. And it was built by another biblical figure who is also connected to Jesus. And the one who built this second aqueduct was also a terrible person from the Bible, Pontius Pilate.
And how do we know that? Well, let's go step by step. Remember when I talked to you in the other segment we did about noticing the construction technique, the architectural style, to know if something is from the time of Oscar Niemeyer or from the colonial Brazil era and so on? Well, another thing the archaeologist needs a sharp eye for is observing renovations and expansions. You've seen it before, whether you live in any city in Brazil or are watching from elsewhere. Sometimes there's a building with a wall. Part of it seems to have collapsed due to a flood or something. The city comes and fixes it, and sometimes they have to rebuild the whole wall. Sometimes they just add a part. And you can notice the difference between the newer plaster and the older one. From the renovation, from the restoration that was done, it's noticeable, isn't it? That's right. The archaeologists also noticed a change here, which indicated 2 things: restoration and expansion of this system. And this restoration showed that by the mortar, by the plaster, there was something that was no longer in the style of Herod. It was later and closely imitated the Roman style of aqueducts, like many built throughout the ancient Roman Empire. In addition to noticing this renovation, this maintenance, they discovered a second path, a second channel. So, as Aline said, Herod built, imagine that my arm would be one of these aqueducts, a channel that would carry water from the pool all the way to the temple, right? Now there's a second channel parallel to this one at a point where the 2 almost meet. And this channel carries water from the reservoir through the aqueduct to the upper city of Jerusalem, which today, for those who know the old city, would be the Herodian quarter, where there's that menorah and there's a synagogue there. And in that larger area, during the time of Jesus, was the neighborhood of the priestly families. One day we'll make a video there too, right, Aline?
Absolutely.
At the Vol Museum, it's incredible. You see ruins of homes once owned by Jerusalem's wealthy elite. There's even a theory about it, but I won't discuss it today. Jesus may have been taken to Annas and Caiaphas's house, which was likely there. There's another tradition that says it could be at Gallicantu, but some think it could be in this complex. This second aqueduct, which was built by Pilate, but let's slow down. So far, what I know is there was an expansion, a restoration, but there's no pipe that says Pilate did this. So we turn to ancient sources. Remember I told you that we use documents from the past? There's a historian whom Aline has already mentioned extensively in her videos. I've also mentioned him in mine. That's Flavius Josephus, who lived here in the 1st century of our era, and he wrote some treatises such as The Wars and the Antiquities. And in one of these books, Flavius Josephus says the following. I'll read it to you in Antiquities, chapter 18, verses 60 to 62. He says, Pilate built an aqueduct to bring water from a distance of about 200 stadia to Jerusalem. Oops, 200 stadia. In our measurement, that would be 35 kilometers. And what archaeologists discovered last year is that the distance of this new path, this new water conduit, is exactly 35 kilometers.
Exactly, because the aqueduct is not in a straight line.
It's not in a straight line?
Exactly. So even though the distance from here to Jerusalem is less than 35 kilometers, if we take the aqueduct route, it totals the 35 kilometers.
Exactly. And more, this aqueduct totals the 35 kilometers. And also something important. There was another restoration at Herodion, which shows that besides the one Pilate built, he also made several improvements in the city. But let's continue. Then came the problem. The improvements included something that deeply offended the religious people of that era. Because as the text says, Pilate used the money from the Korban, and Korban, we know, is the money from the temple, to pay for it. The people were deeply offended, and gathering in Jerusalem, they shouted against him. Pilate sent disguised soldiers with clubs who beat and killed many protesters. So, Pilate, maybe at first, wanted a political gain. They would expand, make improvements in the city to also look good to Caesar. But when he used the temple money to pay for these improvements, the religious leaders did not accept it. And another passage from Josephus, besides this one, says something similar. Now I'm going to read from the Jewish War, chapter 2, verse 177. 177. A large number of Jews perished, some due to the blows they received, others trampled or even killed by their companions in the chaos that followed. Frightened by the fate of the victims, the crowd was reduced to silence. So what do I gather from this information? There was almost the beginning of a civil war, a protest. And even today, when a crowd goes out to protest against the government, something happens. Sometimes the police clash with the crowd, things get out of control, they beat people, people die, and back then it was no different. So, this aqueduct was built by Herod, expanded and renovated by Pilate, but it caused a great uproar in Jerusalem during the time of Pilate.
But I can say, and I think that if the same thing happened today, it would cause an uproar in the same way. Imagine in your city, in your state, in your country, imagine if the government now has little funding and they need money. Imagine if they went into a church, if they went into a synagogue, a mosque, any place, a religious temple, to go in now, take the church's safe, without asking for permission, without anything, open it and say, look, I'm taking this money, take it and use it now to build a public project, a tunnel, a road, a water system, plumbing. Obviously, everyone would be outraged. And at that time, even more so, it wasn't just about a synagogue. He goes into the Temple of Jerusalem, into the treasury of the Temple of Jerusalem, what had been given to the temple for the sacrifices of the temple. And he simply takes that to build a project, even though the project was for Jerusalem. It wasn't for everyone in Jerusalem. It was a project to benefit the people who lived in the most expensive neighborhood in the city, a project for the rich. So he takes from the temple to build for the rich. And without a doubt, that caused an uproar at the time, as Flavius Josephus tells us. For sure, that's the truth, because the people wouldn't let that go unnoticed. But unfortunately, this protest also ended up causing many deaths.
Many deaths. And this indicated to the people, it pointed to embezzlement. There must have been corruption too. A project that would cost 200 ended up costing 400 because 200 went as bribes. And then There's a final part of our conversation here that I'm going to reveal to everyone. Aline, which makes a lot of sense to me in light of the Bible. And look at the coincidence, because this was revealed last year in 2025. And are both episodes related to the same account of Jesus that I'm talking about? A long time ago, I was reading a text from Luke chapter 13 verses 1 and 2, where Jesus talks about two episodes that we didn't know what they were. Jesus was talking about the fall of the Tower of Siloam and about a massacre caused by Pilate. And last year there were, and it's still happening, there are new excavations at the Pool of Siloam. They are recovering some things. There are still new findings, ongoing research, things that we will bring to you as information over time. But they've already discovered that in Siloam there was a tower that was torn down and rebuilt during the time of Pilate. So Pilate rebuilt the tower, but it fell, it collapsed. Keep that information in mind. And this aqueduct shows that at the same time, under the same government, during Pilate's rule, there was this public problem. Because of everything that Aline just said, now I'm going to read the passage about Jesus. If you have a Bible, follow along with me. Luke chapter 13 verses 1 and 2. At that same time, some people came and told Jesus about the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mixed with the sacrifices they were offering. Then Jesus said to them, "Do you think that these Galileans were worse sinners than all the other Galileans because they suffered these things? I can't say for sure, beyond any doubt, but there is a historical and hermeneutical possibility regarding what Jesus is referring to here. It was precisely this uprising of Jews, probably Jews who came from Galilee. And this is an interesting point, because if they came from Galilee, they were pilgrims who, upon arriving in Jerusalem and seeing the misuse of money, became much more outraged than the citizens of Jerusalem, who might have been a bit more restrained because they were used to it. After all, it's an improvement for their city. And the Jews from Galilee, they were really more provocative, more complicated. People spoke badly about them. That's why Jesus coming from Galilee was seen as a very bad thing. And it may be that the reference Jesus makes in Luke 13 verses 1 and 2 is about this episode. Connected to this archaeological finding, part of which we are now visiting.
It's amazing how an archaeological site can connect so many people, because after all, Solomon passed through this area many times. David lived right next door in Bethlehem. So this area is connected to King David, to King Solomon. It is connected to Herod, to Pontius Pilate. And we can see how history connects here in the Holy Land, also through physical places.
Exactly. And to wrap up our conversation, I want to invite everyone at home. Many people act this way whenever I visit the Holy Land. When I pass a group of Brazilians, or even those with me, they say this. You know, Aline, give her a hug for me. And Aline has already said that when they're with her and Rodrigo, send a hug to Rodrigo. So, if you want the best, instead of meeting me and saying hi to Aline, meet Aline and say hi to me.
And God willing, we'll see each other in person here too, so you won't just see it through your cell phone or computer or TV, but you'll also see this place in person, which is so blessed.
To see and touch history, because you'll be the first person to unearth an object that has been buried for thousands of years. Sending you a big hug. It was a pleasure being with you. See you next time.
Shalom.